So in this video, we're going to review the Sabre Production Material Planning page overview. Our goals of the video are to understand the user setup required to view the material planning page. We're going to talk about the summary page and an overview snapshot of your items and some of the replenishment and planning parameters. We're going to dive into how we can look at current supply and demand that may be associated with the specific item. We'll talk a little bit about the filtering and the viewing of the data. And then in subsequent videos, we will look at how we can actually create some supply or change some supply orders based on what we're seeing. So the first place that we're going to start is the user setup. This is going to give users the ability to be able to access the material planning page. You have the ability to be able to put in some default information or setups for the user. You have the ability to set your planning horizons so that you're viewing supply and demand only within a specific period. So let's jump into the software and take a look at how that looks. So if the user is set up in the user setup to be able to view the material planning item worksheet, you can pin a little shortcut or of course use your search. If you've just installed Sabre Production and don't have your user setup done yet, or if perhaps a new user has started, we have to make sure that the system has been told that they can use the material item worksheet. So you would just associate them in the normal Business Central user setup. You would want to just validate that they are listed as one of the users, as the user ID. You really just need to add them into this list. You wouldn't require anything more potentially, but you do have some setups that are here so that you can dictate different views or settings by default for the user. One of the ones that I really like is the material planning default horizon. So this allows me to only see supply and demand orders within a range of time rather than seeing out potentially much further in the future for transactions or supply and demand that I don't necessarily want to be dealing with at this point. There are some additional columns here that you can set different defaults, and of course you can always reach out to your partner or to Sabre to help you with which settings make the most sense for you. The key thing that we want to understand here is that without a user existing in our user setup table, they would get an error if they try to access the material planning page. So the next area I'd like to dive into is the review of the material planning summary page. So when we first launch the material planning item worksheet, you'll see a list of all of your items that have supply and demand and a little snapshot of some of the settings that are on the item card. So as I mentioned, once you have your users and the user setup, you can click on the material planning item worksheet. So what you can do at this point now is you could just select calculate to plan for all of your different locations and see sort of that supply and demand wide open, or you could focus on a specific location if you chose. Your horizon will default in from your user setup if you've selected that. You can choose to calculate. And now what I see is a snapshot of my items that I have supply and demand on. I can see inventory information. I can see what I've got on hand. I can see what I've got on existing orders in the system. I can see a snapshot of planning and replenishment information. The net on hand is really where the power is when you're looking at the material planning worksheet, because this shows me when am I going to be short? Do I have items where maybe I've got excess inventory and maybe I want to look at canceling some supply orders? But essentially, this engine is looking at all of the demand in my system, which are things that are going to be driving my inventory to decrease. So those would be things like safety stock. They could be things like sales orders, production order component lines, anything that is going to, when I post, decrease my inventory. And it's looking at all of my supply orders. So what are things that are going to increase my on hand? They would be things like inventory, purchase order receipts, production order output. And essentially I'm able to see, well, how am I going to be netting out once I've completed those different supply and demand transactions? So you have the ability within here to indicate whether or not you want safety stock to be considered when it's looking at your net on hand. You can include or exclude things like blanket orders. If you wanted to focus the information on things that are just specifically shortages, you could do that. You can set different page filters. So if you wanted to, for example, only see purchased items, only see subassembly items, only see finished good items, you have the ability to slice and dice this item list to be focused on the parts that you need to focus on. So as I mentioned, I could choose to say, well, I would only like to display any items where I'm going to net short. Once I do that, I'm going to click the calculate button because I want the system to look at my items, recalculate them, revalue them. And now I can see that I've got a list of all of the items that potentially I want to look at first so that I can get those supply orders going so that I'm not going to be short in my production process. The final area that I want to look at in this video is going to be how I can filter and view the data. So if I jump back into Business Central again, as I mentioned earlier, this list, maybe it's exactly what I need, but potentially maybe you're looking at it and you're saying, well, I only need to see something within a specific item category code, or perhaps I only want to see purchased or produced items. So as I mentioned previously, you can always filter or view the data by using some of the Booleans that are in your header. You could also set additional page filters so that, again, I can add a filter for anything that's on my item card. I mentioned things like the replenishment system. Perhaps I only want to see things in a purchase state. You could also leverage the item category code, inventory posting group, even a Sabre user field. If you've added additional information that might not even natively be within Business Central, you can select your filters as you need them. And then once you say, okay, I'm getting prompted again to recalculate using my new filters. That is something that I'm going to want to do so that the system can look at my on hand and all of my values based on the information I've entered. And now I can see that this list is even more focused. I can see everything that's got a replenishment system that's set to being purchased. I'm able to focus on, looking at different, maybe the quantity on purchase order. I can see what I've got on hand. I can see what I'm netting. And then as I need to, and as we're going to explore in future videos, you're able to then drill into the material planning of that specific item. And now I can still see the planning. I can see replenishment information, but now I can see the specific demand orders on the left-hand side that are driving my net on hand to be negative. And on the right-hand side, I would be able to see if I have any supply orders that are helping me address those decreases of my inventory. This sums up the material planning overview video. We're going to go into additional detail during our material planning management series. For now, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us using any of the contact information below.